Good morning to all of you, and thanks for being part of Envisioning to 2020. I want to thank Manaz, who has been truly a dear friend of mine, a great inspiration to me. We've known each other now going on 2 decades working in this arena. And what the Women's Learning Partnership has been able to do to give us guideposts wherever we are in terms of what the future could hold if we tap the potential of women is just an extraordinary, powerful organization that is leading the way in ways that are particularly important for these times. So happy birthday to WLP and Manaz, many, many, many more years to come in doing this good work. I was pleased that I could work my crazy schedule with all the UN activities to be here, because I really wanted to be here, not just because I so admire the work of WLP, but because so many of the great women of the Global South associated with this work are people who are true heroines for our times. They are women leading change. They are women who are showing us the way. They are a force for human rights and democratic values, and they are providing us the lessons that we need to learn if we're going to create the kind of world all of us want to see. So I want to thank all of them. I want to say hello to Thoraya Bayed, who's done such an extraordinary job leading UNFPA, and so many of my other friends from Brazil and Jordan and places in between. As Manaz noted, and as I alluded to, we are gathering here in New York, many, actually thousands from around the world, for the Commission on the Status of Women. And this year, that annual meeting at the United Nations coincides with the 15th anniversary of the Fourth World UN Conference on Women that took place in Beijing. And it is something that those of us who were there remember so well. It was an extraordinary coming together, but more than that, it was an extraordinary time to chart a new future. And one of the outcomes of that is WLP, as Manaz just said. And so much has come out of that. And I remember, because at the time I was working for now Secretary Hillary Clinton, then the First Lady of the United States, and she, in an historic address to the gathering, said that I believe we are on the eve of a new millennium, a time to break the silence. It is time for us to say here in Beijing and the world to hear that it is no longer acceptable to discuss women's rights as separate from human rights. And she went on to present a litany of the kind of violence you have gathered to focus on and to eliminate once and for all from our world. She talked about girls who are denied food or drowned or suffocated merely because they are born girls, about the violations that occur when women and girls are sold into human trafficking like commodities, how women are raped in their own communities or subjected to it as a tactic of war, about the violations that occur worldwide among women, the violence that they are subjected to in their own homes. And she said, after going through this litany that touched so many people in that great hall that day because they were dealing with these very issues, and these issues were raised up for all to recognize. And she culminated that horrible litany and said, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. Beijing sparked a movement. You are part of that movement still. It gave us a call to action that women have a right to education, to health care, to jobs, to credit, to freedom from violence, the opportunity to enjoy equal rights, and to participate fully in the political and economic lives of their countries. As we mark this anniversary, it is a time to assess our progress, to develop new strategies, to address the persistent obstacles that still hold back the advancement of women and girls in so much of the world. That is why you are here gathered, to mobilize for women's rights. Because it remains a simple fact that no country can get ahead if half of its citizens are left behind. And today there is a growing body of research, voluminous data that has been accumulated long from the days when we were all gathered in Beijing. And that research from the UN or the World Bank, from corporations, from think tanks, from institutions, from NGOs, shows that there is a favorable correlation between investments in women and poverty alleviation, economic growth, and a country's general prosperity. Unfortunately, the potential that women and girls represent to the future of our world is still largely untapped. I believe that we can no longer relegate women's issues, put them in quotation marks, women's issues, as just that. Some special category, some nice place. Yes, very important issues, but perhaps not always important enough when one looks at all of the challenges our world confronts. But the truth of the matter is, these are the very hard power issues. These are the issues, if addressed, that will help us chart that future that we all want to see in our world. And these are the issues that really are the hardest issues in some ways to solve. And we cannot get there without unleashing the power that half the world's population represents. Secretary Clinton recently noted that until women around the world are accorded their rights and afforded opportunities for education, health care, gainful employment, and so much more, global progress and prosperity will have its own glass ceiling. I want to touch this morning on just a few of the major areas of the Beijing Platform for Action, because it is our unfinished agenda. These concerns merit our attention, as WLP is fully giving them. They deserve our commitment of greater political will, and they really need to guide policy and budgetary priorities for our governments. Since Beijing, so many laws have been adopted, but they need to be enforced and fully implemented to make the kind of progress we all want to see. So first, the right to an education. I think all of you know that educating girls is the most effective development investment any country can make, that the benefits to girls and their families are well documented, from better health and nutrition to delayed marriage and enhanced employment opportunities. Studies show that an extra year of education increases a girl's income by 10 to 20% and is a very important step for her breaking out of the cycle of poverty. Today, of the approximately 13 million illiterate young people around the world, 63% are female. So we have our work cut out for us. And although we have made great strides, we are still falling short of the Millennium Development Goals, those goals adopted 10 years ago by the United Nations to help end poverty once and for all, goals for all the world to try to achieve. And the current economic and financial crisis has increased the number of girls dropping out of school because their families are feeling the strains of keeping them in school. We have found over the years that a range of interventions, from the elimination of school fees to providing school meals or incentives to families, simple things like a bag of flour, a canister of oil to a poor family, is enough to encourage them, to incent them to send their girls to school and to keep them in school. These practices can make such a difference, from keeping the girls from being married off while still children, and ease the burdens on families who are trying so hard to eke out their existence. The quality of education still must be addressed. The safety of girls in school, going to and from school, continue to be imperatives. And secondary education is still elusive to too many and needs to be a top priority for all of us. Every girl should be able to go to school, because we not only shortchange her if she doesn't, we shortchange our world of the potential that she represents. Second, the right to economic participation. Multiple studies have shown that women are the key drivers of economic growth. The Economist magazine quoted some data that underscores this by saying, forget China, forget India, forget the internet. It is women who drive GDP. Women invest up to 90% of their incomes in their families and their communities, and they are the best and most efficient investment in raising the standard of living around the world. Over the last 15 years since Beijing, microcredit, small amounts of credit, particularly to the poorest of the poor, have lifted up tens of millions of women and their families out of poverty. Today, upwards to 80 to 90% of micro borrowers are women, because they are good investments and they pay their loans back on time. Microcredit, as important as it is, however, and as much as it needs to grow and be available, is not enough. Women need markets for their products. They need education and training. They need the ability to grow businesses from micro enterprises into small and medium-sized enterprises. SMEs are really where the growth potential lies. Trade and economic policies that affect them rarely consider their needs. And all of this needs to change if their potential for economic growth is to be unleashed. Women's interests must be included in our overall economic policy initiatives. Third, the right to participate in the political life of our societies. Women are still underrepresented in the parliaments and the legislatures of nearly every country on earth. Their voices need to be heard, not only because women have the right to participate in the processes and decisions that affect them, but also because the world needs to hear women's perspectives and experiences. I remember working over many years to help women in Kuwait who were struggling to get the right to vote and stand for office. They worked very hard, and I remember one very successful woman, a professor in her country, she said, "Why do I work so hard for this right?" She said, "I've got a fabulous family. I have a terrific job that challenges me. I have good friends. I have everything in life I would ever want." And she expressed this at a program in Washington and said that that morning she had had an experience. We had taken her to our Congress where she was met with women from both sides of the political spectrum who told her how they had come together to work on legislation that affects women's health or women's access to funding for sports and universities, women's access to credit and small business incentives. And she said, I listened to them, and I said to myself, imagine what we could do in our country if we got the right to vote and stand for office. And just last year, finally, after getting the right to vote and stand for office, 4 women were elected to the parliament. And I remember working with them as they were struggling as to how they were going to make their case, because they hadn't been able to succeed with their parliament on achieving the right to vote and stand for office, which seems so basic. And they were struggling with their theme, which had been women's rights, to be sure. And then as they thought about it, they said it wasn't just women's rights, it was about the future of their country. And they added, because this was about the future of Kuwait. And young people came together, women came together across the spectrum, and men joined their cause because they realized this was about the future. It is like envisioning 2020. What is the future we want to see? And there is something called Security Council Resolution 1325. And that is something we are still struggling to achieve 10 years after it was passed. And that is that women have a right, and their countries and our world needs them to exercise the right to participate in peacemaking, in peace negotiations, in post-conflict resolution. They need to be at the table, or the peace will never hold as it might. And these 10 years later, as we struggle in so many places around the world to get women to the tables where negotiations are going on and deliberations are taking place and conversations about them and their families are occurring, they need to be there to participate. And where they have been, from Northern Ireland to Rwanda, the outcome has been to the benefit of their countries and our world. Fourth, the right to be free from violence. This could not be a more critical issue, and one that you will be grappling with throughout this day. Violence against women and girls is a global pandemic. Its scope and its scale make it simultaneously one of the largest and most entrenched human rights and development issues before us. It affects girls and women at every point in their lives. This violence cannot be explained away as cultural. It is criminal, and it needs to be dealt with because it is a crime. Women in Africa first put this on the agenda for the world in the Nairobi conference, which preceded Beijing. And in Beijing, once and for all, it was chiseled into international human rights law. These kinds of abuses not only destroy the lives of individual girls and women, but they rob our world of the talent we urgently need. Combating violence against women and girls must be a major policy priority. It is truly a human rights issue. It is a security issue. The most dangerous places in the world are the most dangerous places for women, especially. It is a productivity issue. When women are abused or worried about their families, the productivity of countries goes down dramatically. And it is a health issue, both in terms of what happens to the well-being of the woman and girl. But today, so much of the violence is contributing to the escalating rate of HIV infection around the world. So this is an issue that must be dealt with. In our own country, our Congress, in the last couple months, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Relations Committee, held groundbreaking hearings on this issue because of the consequences that it represents and because it affects so many critical areas. Since Beijing, more and more countries have been criminalizing violence against women. Yet violence continues to exact a toll on all societies. Laws are too often not implemented or enforced, and I think one of the things we must discuss and work on is how to ensure that those laws really make a difference and do what they are designed to do. We know that when women have access to economic empowerment, there is less violence in their lives. I remember once, years ago, sitting with a group of women in India with SEWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. SEWA has done incredible work with the poorest of the poor, and these women had been rag pickers. They had miserable lives by any definition, unimaginable lives. But with credit and training and empowerment, they were in a different place. And we asked these women, how had their lives changed? And one woman stood up and she said, "I am no longer afraid." And I thought that was a statement powerful in and of itself. Imagine, I am no longer afraid. And then she went on to say, "I am not afraid of the police. I am not afraid even of my mother-in-law." And in India, that is saying quite a bit. But imagine to go through life unafraid, as I think all of us clearly have the ability to do if we're fortunate. So what economic empowerment does is change one's well-being so significantly from a terrible situation, a vulnerable situation, a condition of fear, to an enhanced position that makes violence less real in those lives. Education is critical to fighting violence against women. It makes all the difference to know who you are, to have an education, to know what your rights are, not to be as vulnerable and put in situations that make your life much different than it could be. But I think today we also need to look at the less traditional allies that we've had and to chart some new directions. We clearly must engage men in this struggle. And at the United Nations over the last several days, there have been many side events to the major plenary sessions. Many of those events have focused on violence against women because of the magnitude of the challenge it represents. And so many of those events have been focused on the role that men need to play. And there are growing numbers of organizations that are working to bring men together to really focus on the difference that they can make. Because as so many women tell me, this room is predominantly women, and thank you for the few men who are here who always stand at our side and get us to where we want to go. But we really need to have the men fully engaged. And there are organizations from Man Up, an extraordinary group that is focusing on the difference that particularly young men can make, that different cultural aspects like music and videos and other kinds of materials can be utilized to send across messages. But also there are, and I know you have worked with, WLP has worked with projects in Brazil, in Nigeria, that I'm sure will be discussed in the course of this day to show what a difference it makes. When I was recently in India, I met with a group from Rajasthan. and saw a skit performed by men. They took on the roles of men and women in this skit, and it was all about the respect that women deserve and what is wrongful behavior. And when I complimented the men afterwards, their smiles were from cheek to cheek, as big as they could be, because they knew that from village to village, they were having an impact, and life was changing for the girls and women in the place where they lived. So men really need to be more significantly engaged, and we must bring them into this conversation. We also need to bring religious leaders into this conversation. And I think particularly of the projects that have been done with mullahs. I think, for example, in Afghanistan, where mullahs have had such a positive impact, for example, on bringing midwives into training where they would not have been able to leave their homes because of the constraints on them. But they have intervened and explained that it is important that the women go for this training to come home and benefit greater numbers in their village, in their setting, or have used the Friday services to speak out about how wrong violence against women is and how inconsistent it is with the values and tenets of their faith. So untraditional allies perhaps, but truly important allies in this struggle. And we need to learn from each other, and that's what you will be doing today. What has been working? What can be replicated to other places? What can be scaled up? What can have greater consequences for good? Women in regions of conflict are particularly vulnerable. When women are attacked as part of a deliberate and coordinated strategy, as they are in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo or Sudan or so many other places, the glue that holds a community together completely dissolves. Large populations not only become displaced and destabilized, and around the world, these places are so dangerous for women, to be sure, but also pose great threats to international peace and security. Where women are oppressed, where governance is weak, terrorists and extremists are more likely to take hold. This kind of violence against women is nothing less than an issue of national security for all of us wherever we live. And I have seen in this area of Global South, from Malaysia, which I think passed the first Violence Against Women Act years ago. I was recently there and met with so many women who were on the front lines of this struggle and continue to work on this issue. I see Asma Khadar here from Jordan, the extraordinary work that has been going on there, much of which she is responsible for in terms of passing a strong violence against women law, upgrading shelters and making them most available. They're doing innovative work now with the private sector and sponsoring family life centers where people can be safe. Honor killing case recently garnered a 15-year sentence against the perpetrator. These are really important steps, and the kinds of women you will be hearing from in the course of this day are women who are leading this kind of change. Lastly, and there are so many other issues, and I will hardly do it justice, but I must mention the right to health. And I'm happy that our President Obama, has provided a new global health initiative, which we are pushing forward with the support of the Congress, to not only continue the kind of support that the United States has provided to deal with HIV/AIDS and other infectious diseases, but to really make a commitment of resources to ending maternal mortality. You know, someplace in the world, every woman or a woman is dying every minute in childbirth, and so many more are suffering debilitating reactions that make them unable to do their life's work as mothers and all the other kinds of obligations that they have. It is a terrible, terrible problem. And the initiative that the President has put forward will work to staunch maternal mortality, provide greater access to family planning, and generally improve women's access to a continuum of care. It is going to be a women-centric initiative. And this is something, particularly as we look at those Millennium Development Goals, one of them has to do with this issue. And over the last 10 years, it is the goal that has made hardly any progress. And before I close, I want to mention one other issue that is the subject of a great deal of discussion at the United Nations, and that is the creation of a women's agency at the United Nations, a place where the groups, the entities that currently exist will come together in a composite to bring greater force to these issues. An Under General Secretary Under Secretary General who will be at the table on these issues to focus on them more keenly in ways that will drive us to the goals of what you are here to do today. I just saw Shirin Ebadi come in, and I want to welcome you because you are truly not only a Nobel laureate, but one of those great leaders who are changing our world for the good. So welcome. Our work is far from done. We must use this time, not just this 15th anniversary, but all of the time ahead of us, to recommit to the goals of the Beijing Platform for Action, to mobilize for women's rights, to eliminate violence against women, to envision what 2020 should look like. We need to push this agenda forward because to do otherwise would be to hold back one of the most powerful, positive forces for shaping the world, and that is advancing the potential of women and girls. Women's rights are truly human rights, and human rights are women's rights, and we cannot settle for anything less. Thank you very much.